Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the Deep Dive at its new home physically and its new home on Mondays. Part of the idea for having it on Mondays is that we know a lot of small groups and small group leaders use this as a resource, and so we wanted to get it earlier in the week. And so thanks for being flexible. Glad you can be here. I want to start off by introducing who's going to be our teacher for this fall. He's going to be doing all of the sessions, and I'll be making an appearance, hanging around every now and then. But this is Ryan Kennedy. Hopefully most of you at least recognize Ryan or have met him before. Yeah. So Ryan is, not that this is the most important thing, because I think you can be, educated in the Bible without having a formal education. But Ryan does have a formal education, an MDiv, right?
PhD.
PhD. Wow, look at that. So he's Dr. Kennedy. Yeah. Dr. Kennedy. So
PhD stands for Push Here Dummy, so I can operate.
Yeah.
I'm going to call you Dr. Kennedy now.
Dr. Kennedy, there you go. I didn't know that. Look at that. Yeah, somebody had asked me, does he have any formal education? And I was like, I don't know. And Jim interrupted me and said, no, he has an MDiv, and now I was even wrong there. So there you go. Dr. Kennedy is here, and he's so he knows his stuff. He approaches the Bible with a lot of experience, not just in education, but as a reader of the Bible, and a long time Christian. He has experience teaching, a lot of men's ministry stuff in your background, but other things as well. And so he's going to be able to bring the goods as we come to the scriptures together. I'm just really excited and really thankful that you're stepping into this role. That being said, I don't think Dr. Kennedy here wants to shoulder the load forever being the only teacher here at Deep Dive. And so help us out, and if you think of anyone that you know who has the ability to teach or the desire to teach in things like this, who are in your circles here at church, we would love to get those names, because we are looking to build up the team a little bit there. So all that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan. Let me pray as we get started here today. Father God, we pause and we remember your Spirit is present here with us. We remember as we open your scriptures and as we talk about these things that we're not only coming to them to learn or to gain knowledge, but we're coming to them to have an experience with you, to grow in our love for you and our awareness of your presence and our desire to move out on mission, to partner in your mission in this world. And so, Lord, we pray that as we come to the Word of God this morning, that you would empower Ryan to speak truth, to challenge our assumptions, to lift off the veil of what we might normally experience here, and help us go deeper into the text. And Lord, we also pray that we would walk away today ready to love our neighbor more, ready to love you more rightly, and to see the world more as you would have us see it. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Give Ryan a hand. Be nice to him.
All right, well, I'm glad you guys could all make it this morning. Hopefully you'll still be awake by the time we're done. But we did it in the morning, so you all would not need naps till the afternoon. As Colin and I were talking about this a couple weeks ago, he had decided to kind of take the path and really look at this and outline the scripture, the forming, the filling, looking at where God created. I'm going to take a slightly different tack, because I think, at least for this week, I want to give you guys some arguments of why I think creation and God hold up. We're in a society that's assaulting us under the guise of science, trying to say, oh, it can't possibly be the case. And so, as we think about this, and it starts off, in Hebrew, the title for Genesis is actually Bereshit, which really means in the head of or the beginning of. Many of the early books were titled based upon their first sentences or first few words, to kind of give it a sense. And so hopefully you saw from what Colin had said, so there were a couple of big ideas. Obviously, one of them was that everything comes from God and belongs to Him. And I think this is crucial as we think about particularly Genesis 1 and to a degree Genesis 2. Granted, Genesis 1 is a very poetic style So I'm certainly open to the idea that there are many ways you can kind of interpret this, whether it's 24-hour days, ages, gaps. Genesis 2, I think it's pretty specific, and it starts to feel like a descriptive. And so we'll see that obviously next week. But, just a quick review, God is eternal. He is omnipotent and all-powerful. He is transcendent. That existence came because of his particular design and choice. And as we'll see as we go through this, that design element comes all the way down to us today. Right now, right with our gifts, with our ability to take breath today, all this was planned before the beginning of time. We weren't some cosmic accident. We weren't pointless. There was a very specific point, and each of us has our own gifts to use as part of that. And I think a lot of times, we may struggle to figure out, okay, God, for this season, what do you want me doing? But I think God has a very, very specific imprint on us. As we understand it, have mapped the human genome, we understand billions of combinations of protein are unique to us. Our fingerprints are unique. So many aspects of us are distinctive that I think it was God trying to tell us this story. He brings order out of chaos. Another one is just that man was a special creation by God, and we'll see this more next week, but this idea that God created a whole lot of other stuff, and then he said, okay, now I'm going to give this head over creation, mankind. And in fact, the term Adam in Hebrew really does more descriptively talk about broadly mankind. We see that we can rebel against God. There are seasons that happens, but to be his rival. One of the things Genesis doesn't obviously tell us is the whole history of Satan and the fall of the angels. But we know from the after effect, there was a rebellion. But Satan is obviously not God's rival. He is subservient to the Creator. That life without God is chaos, and that ultimately our relationship has cosmic importance. I love the line out of Gladiator. He says, what we do echoes in eternity. And there is this idea in a secular world that somehow we're supposed to build our own empire, our monuments to self, where God says, no, you're working on behalf of my kingdom so that your influence will be rejoiced in heaven. That whether it be through evangelism and winning souls, whether it be discipling others, whether it be just the acts of service and mercy, the simple act of kindness that makes somebody's day. I know a lot of you help out at the food pantry. That is one of those places we see people at their desperate moments. Each week we're seeing several new Ukrainian families coming that, sadly now the trend is single moms with young kids whose husbands were killed in the war. Now they're in a place in a foreign land, very often not speaking the language, dealing with grief of, incredible burden, and trying to make their way. And so there's a practical place where we can be part of delivering a message of hope. Were there any questions that came out from yesterday of Colin's talk that you guys wanted to bounce around? It was 100% clear, it all made sense.
Colin's good.
All right, so I'll jump into the slightly different twist. I think one of these concepts of Genesis being in the beginning is that it gives us an account of why we're here and how we got here. This is one of the things the secular world struggles most with, that they, in their effort to displace God, have in essence had to displace truth, morality, purpose. That if it's really just this cosmic dust that took accidental form, the French existentialists were right. There really is no meaning. But if there is a creator who distinctly and uniquely created us, then we actually have a purpose. Part of that is to worship God, part of it is to serve God, part of it is just to align with his purposes, and that we will find pleasure. Just as God found pleasure in creation, he gave us tasks to do that we would find pleasure as well, and that gets more clearly outlined in chapter 2, but it definitely is a component to this. Colin briefly talked about this, where some people piously proclaim in the beginning God. I say in the beginning hydrogen. That's the clear choice. Either you must accept God as the source of all, or reject him and accept matter and chance as source. This was Professor Shapley at Harvard Observatory. He's an atheist, but he understands the choice. that there, and many of the atheists have had to make this very distinctive choice that says, I refuse God, therefore it must be chance. It must be statistics. You have a question?
If it's chance, what caused the Big Bang?
Well, that is a primary problem. And in fact, it's the reason why the Big Bang has heavily been left behind by the modern science.
Okay.
And they love to spend time talking about nanoseconds after creation. Like, well, as soon as it happens, then these things happen. You go, okay, but as Aristotle talked about, what was the prime mover, the event, the spark that created? And as we'll think about this a little bit in a minute, the definition of time is the relative motion of two or more objects. So things had to be absolutely still, even at the quantum level where there was time. And this is a very, very problematic thing if you want to argue that there was this kind of goo of stuff that existed out there that somehow was still in waiting, that now exploded or transformed, or string theory or whatever you want to use, to this ever-expanding infinite universe. The force required, again, equal and opposite reactions, would have been beyond anything we can comprehend. And I think this is why you see even guys like Richard Dawkins, who's a very famous atheist, now holding to what he calls the alien seeding theory, that the Earth was seeded by aliens. Of course, he can't tell us where the aliens came from, but he goes, well, it's so complicated, it's statistically impossible now. As we learn more and more about the universe, the problem becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I think even at the time of the ancient Greeks, obviously pre-Christ, you had elements that were basic, 4 elements. Our periodic table is much bigger than that now. Our understanding of the molecular world is very different now, even at the subatomic levels. And so the things that might have even fit, as Colin talked about some of these other creation myths, become very problematic when you understand the extent of the galaxy as it is. And I think this is where secular people you encounter don't really want to wrestle through this. The scientists have had to kind of go, we're not sure. And in fact, as I'll talk about in a minute, there was a Nobel Prize for physicists this year that actually disproved effectively Einstein's general theory of relativity. About 3 weeks ago it was awarded, and so that's created a whole new problem because the standard model of physics has now been broken because of quantum entanglement. And so what we've based most of the modern energy era on has now been disrupted. And so they're going back to the drawing board going, oh, oops, we got to explain now something else.
Well, can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you mean by entanglement?
I'll talk about that in a minute, but the idea is at the quantum level, particles at vast distances seem to operate together in unison. There is a force in the cosmos at the microscopic level that allows things to be interconnected and create mass.
Okay.
And so this entanglement theory is one of the things that has been emerging in very recent science, really the last decade. Some mathematical theories back to the 70s, but in physical sciences the last decade. And that has had to give rise to some interesting twists, and this is part of why the Big Bang now no longer kind of fits the model, because now you have things at submolecular level that are in motion and interacting with each other. And I think it's part of where God talks about that his creation, his plans confound even the wise in human terms. So, yeah.
Were you a scientist before you were a Christian, or were you a Christian?
I've been walking this faith for about 40 years, so I was a fairly young man. I went back and got my PhD at about 33, 34, and it was a doctor of philosophy with an emphasis in divinity. And so the science is self-learned. I have enjoyed math, but it's something I've invested time into because I think it's important for believers to at least have the building blocks of argument when we hear a world that's just saying over and over and over again, oh, the science says. Well, okay, let's see what the science says.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
We all need people.
Yes.
Isn't the bottom line basically
they're looking for answers to questions that aren't answerable. The only answer is God, and they don't want to accept
Yeah.
God is the answer.
That's exactly right, and I think the honest atheists say because they will not accept the premise of God, they must look for other explanations. And that puts them in sometimes some real problematic issues, both at a mathematical and a philosophical level. So this slide here, you can see on the left this statue of one of the Greek gods. How many of you think that it just happened to evolve out of stone and that was the way it just mysteriously appeared?
Right.
Nobody? Oh, come on, that's way less complex than the universe. How about some pigment just threw itself on canvas
Right.
and created a random pattern?
No.
Yet that's inert. That's not even self-replicating biological matter. How about this? Maybe some glass particles came together.
Yeah.
Any of you been over to Seattle to see that exhibit? Yeah, it's a great exhibit if you have a chance. Over in Space Needle. Or down here, maybe some mud and clay came together with a little pigment, so it shaped itself. Anybody buying it? Tree, kind of just weird design, it grew that way. Again, these are all inert objects. These are way more statistically probable than the simplest single-cell organism. And yet, logically, without having to have great science degrees, you go, that's weird. I don't buy that that was random. I think there was a creator that ascribes, or many people that participated in creating it. And so I would say we also see design even through the telescope at the macro level. You know, when you see through the Hubble telescope 10,000 galaxies, you know, where our own galaxy is hundreds of millions of light years across, you know, even moving at 490,000 miles an hour is the spin on the Milky Way, compared to 30 some odd thousand for the Earth. It still takes over 200 million years to do one revolution. At almost 500 million miles an hour. And there's 10,000 of them in one shot. Yeah. You know, some of the nebulas and pulsar stars, and you start seeing this artistic imprint, even in space where most of it's just dead vacuum. And yet God says, okay, you go invent your new device, and I'll go, poof, here you go.
Yeah.
You want to understand? Oh, okay, I'll just let you know it's a little bigger than you thought before. And we'll probably see new images from the latest space telescope in the next few weeks to months. The other side is the microscope. You break out and go super small. Here on the left is a pollen spore and then some of the particles within it. If you saw this shape, you might think Epcot Center, but you'd certainly think, a geodesic dome probably had a designer. How many think this is the Grand Canyon?
That was my first thought.
All right.
I mean, when I saw it, I thought, oh, Grand Canyon, please. I don't think that's big enough.
No. No, that's actually Kraken steel under a microscope.
Oh.
So you can start to see the rust forming, the oxidation.
Yeah.
So the majesty of God's handiwork is present at both ends of our understanding, at the biggest end through space, at the smallest end at the subatomic levels even. And I think this is where believers for hundreds of years have talked about the amazingness of the starry sky above and the moral law within. That it's almost really difficult when you get out there and you see, even with the naked eye, the Milky Way streaking across the sky, to go, okay, this was complete random space dust that just kind of happened to assemble itself. A few more interesting ones, life reflecting art, or art reflecting life. No, it's not a Van Gogh painting. It's actually basal skin carcinoma under a microscope. Don't think Van Gogh ever saw it, so I don't think he drew inspiration from it. But in the case of art imitating life, you know, it is amazing the color. Why is that evolutionarily necessary to have beauty? Just a single villia from the intestinal tract and the complexity of it. Anybody want to guess what this one on the right is? I know it's not photoshopped with happy faces. That's actually how it looks.
It makes me think of amoeba, but
Close. Any other guesses? It's actually a cell of grass.
oh,
They call it the happy cell because it does look like smiley faces. Guess it could be chance, or it could you got laughing at scientists who want to claim it's without him. Aristotle, and again this is pre-Christ, said math is either a happy coincidence or a descriptive of a highly ordered system. You know, we see this, and I'll show you some images of math appearing in nature, but the natural log of E, for instance, we base decibel scales, Richter scales on it, because we know that this progression mirrors itself perfectly in nature. You know, we can see it in the brightness of star and pH balance of chemistry. You get pi that repeats itself all the time in anything that's circular in nature. Why do these constants seem to keep appearing? Fibonacci numbers, number sequences that are progressive in growth. You can see it all over the place. Seashells, hurricanes, the universe, food, pollen pods. You know, that there's this place where we see this repetition over and over and over again and start screaming for a design. If you saw a repeating pattern across that wall, you'd go, there was a human painter or designer for it. And so I think in the same way, it's reasonable to say, if we see all these mathematical patterns that repeat themselves over and over and over again in nature, there was a designer. Fractal sequence is another number series that occurs all the time. Lightning, snowflakes, certain plant life. These progressive series of numbers that are predictive. And so, you know, I use these as arguments for a creator. I would say that there is such intricate design and intent, and as we'll see next week a little bit, we'll do some textual analytics and we'll talk a lot about human DNA, eyes, skin, amazing functions within the human body that God created in a moment, to which science struggles to even begin to replicate. You know, everything we know about medicine doubles about every 3.2 years right now. For all of our best efforts, for instance, we still can't treat most types of spinal cord injury. We can't synthetically recreate a spinal cord. We've gotten a few singular neuron equivalents in computing and got woohoo! Never mind, there's trillions of them in the human body. Galileo says mathematics is the language with which God wrote the universe. And I don't need you to all be math wizards, but do understand that we see these mathematical formulas, and in many cases, like Einstein, brilliant guy, he was able to predict things mathematically that they had never seen. It wasn't really until the CERN collider, you know, that we got particles fast enough to smash into each other that we could actually see what worked mathematically. 60, 70 years later. So, isn't it interesting that even the Greek philosophers could start with geometry and basic versions of calculus and predict certain things to be true of the universe? And it took thousands of years in some cases to fully validate those. So I want to give you two quick arguments, you know, because a lot of times you will have that discussion with a non-believer and they quickly want to go into, well, who made it? And why do you believe there's a God? One of them, cosmological argument. I was very fortunate to have Dr. Craig as my doctrine professor, but he really popularized this argument. If you ever want to watch some interesting YouTube, you can search his name and see some of the debates he's had with leading scientists and philosophers around the world. But his basic argument, the one he uses most often, is the Kalam-based cosmological argument, which in essence says, and you get these in your notes, Whatever begins to exist has a cause to its existence. Something starts it. And the Greek philosophy was the prime mover. Since the universe began to exist, and I won't bore you with the time-space argument, he actually went back and got his master's in physics just so he could write this, and made all of our poor undergrad heads explode trying to read the 38-page doctoral thesis or thesis on time. But science has accepted that you can't cross an infinite, therefore time and space must have had a beginning. And hence why, for at least decades, Big Bang was one of the prevailing thoughts.
What was his name again?
Dr. William Lane Craig.
Thank you.
And he says, therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. It's a logical argument. If there's a start, and everything that has a start must have a creator or something that caused it. Therefore, there must be a cause for the universe. And if we accept just what we know of space being so massive and at least functionally infinite, as far as we can tell, the cause must have been equally functionally infinite. This doesn't get us to Judeo-Christian God, I'll grant the premise, but it gets us to a creator God. And I think this is the other thing that I always find interesting, is the creation myth and flood myths are the two that are most prevalent across almost all societies. If we really were random chance, why would there be all these creation myths? If there was no beginning that was part of some version of oral tradition to be recorded, why is there a universal set of creation stories that have awfully large parallels? And I would argue because they were rooted in the reality of Adam and Eve. There was a creation, there was a starting point, there was a God who started it. And the corollary then to this is that cause of a universe must be eternal, it has to exist outside of time, and it must be absolutely self-sufficient in and of itself. Can't have another mover before it, that would be the first move. And only God, at least a God that we would define as all-powerful and eternal, would fit that definition. It can't be these created gods that we see in a lot of the creation myths, because they then have a beginning. And you still have that problem of, okay, where did the egg come from, the first God come from, or the waters come from, or whatever you want to analyze in each of them. The hero Gilgamesh, where did these things come from, if not for an original creation? Have I made everybody's head hurt yet?
Yeah.
But in your notes, you get your three basic premises. And it's very simply, whatever began has a cause. The universe began, or started to exist. Therefore, the universe must have a cause. And at the end of the day, that cause must be sufficient to explain the universe that we understand. Which is exactly why now you have had so many alternatives to Big Bang, because the complexity is too great to explain by a random explosion. The teleological argument, this was the old watchmaker. If you find the watch in the field, you assume there was a creator of the watch. Because we just saw some pictures of things, none of you bought that those were random evolution. And this has been discussed for thousands of years of human history. This isn't a new argument by any stretch of the imagination. And Socrates, almost 500 years before Christ, argued a supreme intelligence, and his idea of using reason. One of his illustrations, if you went to the marketplace, you saw things, you assumed, these made things had creators and design and intent. And if the universe is way bigger than the carved donkey, then there must be something far more supreme as a designer, as an influence, that made that. Plato was one of the first to use this phrase, order from chaos. And the Greeks recognized that things tended towards disorder, not order. Thomas Aquinas probably more formalized this when he said, whatever lacks knowledge cannot move towards an end unless it is directed by something. If something's going to progress, it has to be guided, it has to have intelligence behind it. And obviously inanimate objects, rocks and trees and things like that, don't have intelligence. Therefore, there must have been something guiding it. And quite honestly, this is where guided evolution comes from. They would say, well, because we accept an older Earth definition, we believe there is a creator, and he kind of guided or he put it in place to explain it and try to kind of cross the bridge. I happen to hold to a literal 7-day view, but there's certainly room for interpretation beyond that. But I think this idea of a finely tuned universe, this precision, these mathematical constants, the very ways that life, the prerequisites of life on Earth to continue. The Earth tilt on its axis, as it spins, is about 23.5 degrees. We then circle around the sun at a certain distance. All of those factors are really, really important. If the Earth started wobbling even a little bit, the catastrophic effect of that is tremendous. Well, we know there are lots of other moons, for instance, in the solar system. All of those other moons orbit the sun at that same elliptical plane. The moon is the only one that orbits the axis of a planet. And that provides all of our tides and our seasons so we understand them. And it actually keeps that 23.5 degree tilt within about a half a degree at any given moment. If it followed the pattern of all the other moons in our solar system, life as we know it would come to an end on Earth. That's just one example of the precision that's required for life to be present here as we understand it. And there are thousands more examples. So this finely tuned universe, the watch model was very primitive compared to what we now understand in modern mathematics and physics. As Colin alluded to, the second law of thermodynamics states that entropy of the universe is always increasing. Entropy is the measure of disorder or randomness. And if you ever want to see this present, go look in your junk drawer in your kitchen or your car trunk or your garage after it hasn't been cleaned for a little while. Do you find this immaculate ordered system? Or does it start to look like a little chaos went off and maybe a tornado in some people's cases? So isn't it interesting that the conclusions of the universe to the atheists are the unintended consequence of the world was this perfectly balanced ordered system? That it defied this rule. It defied the first rule of thermodynamics. You can't create matter out of nothing. The matter is neither created nor destroyed. It might turn to energy briefly, but you don't see it in this ex nihilo without anything or nothing going to something that, again, breaks the physics rules. And so it's very interesting to me that those who would say to someone like myself, well, you're foolish for believing in a God, I simply respond, but you don't believe your own math and philosophy. You'll discard it because you don't like the conclusion. And the reason you're scared is we're not talking about the Easter Bunny or the Tooth Fairy. We're talking about a creator that at some intrinsic level, virtually every person who I've talked to, the most hardened atheists, I've had one out of 40 years that ever said, you know what, I think I'm purely biochemistry. There's nothing eternal in me. There's nothing non-physical, non-corporeal to me. There's no mind, there's no soul. I'm just a byproduct of functional machinery. All the rest have had to say to some levels, there is a mind, there is a soul, there is something that's transcendent to the biological material that makes up my body. Most admit they hope there's something eternal. Yet isn't it interesting, if you don't have a creator, well, what is that eternity? Well, what's the whole point? And yet we have the ability in Genesis to really see a starting point, an exclamation point. We see bookends, the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life in Revelation. We see through one man Adam, sin entering the world, through one man Christ, it being redeemed, and ultimately a new heaven and a new earth being created to fulfill God's intended perfect order, without sin, without death, without pain. And so the flip side is without God. Okay, we'll put on our evolutionist hat for a minute. No God. Poof. He's gone. We're now byproducts of chance. Why are we here? Is there any real absolute meaning to life? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die. That's about as good as it gets. And so I always have 5 basic questions for evolutionists. And these are in your notes. Where did it all come from? We see this vastness and ever increasing understanding of space. How in the world did it all get here? How can fundamentally an explosion create a finely tuned universe? If we put a little paint can, in one of the rooms over here and set it off with a little detonation, how many think we'd find the Mona Lisa on the wall? No? How many think we'd find an awfully big mess of paint splatter?
Yeah. Chaos.
That's what modern physics tells us is reasonable. We can run an experiment over and over and over and over again and get the exact same results. So why was creation different? What explains that if you take God out? How can life come from rocks? We spend a lot of time looking around Mars lately, looking for any signs of water, obviously any signs of even basic life. We don't expect to find it, by the way, coming out of the rocks. We're hoping to find little particles somewhere in the sand, in between the rocks. So why is it in Mars we go looking for life separate from rock? Yet in modern cosmology, apart from God, we go, oh, of course, totally logical. Carbon just created life. How do complex biological systems just assemble by accident? The first rule of biogenesis is it takes life to create life. In our best laboratory experiments, with all we understand about DNA and chemistry and biochemistries, we still haven't been able to create a single cell organism of life from inert matter. Why? If it's just that easy, we certainly ought to be able to pull it off. And why do we have a conscience or a soul? What makes us different from the rest of the animal kingdom that we seem to be self-aware and we seem to be able to make choices, like as parents, to delay our gratification or our own self-preservation for the benefit of our children? Where heavily in the animal kingdom, you don't see any ability to differ from the imprinted DNA structure. Survival is primary. We have people who willingly sacrifice their lives for others. We have people that will run into burning buildings to save other people, call them firemen. Their DNA, their genetics ought to tell them self-preservation goes, don't run into a burning building. There's something unique about humanity that goes towards danger and instead of always fleeing it. Yes?
I learned this from a physicist friend.
Mhm.
Don't protons and neutrons fit into this?
Yes.
That's what we're all made out of, right?
Yep.
Atoms?
See, you're going to get to one more slide ahead.
Wasn't it?
You're getting one slide ahead on me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But yes, they are. And then still, those are physical characteristics that have defined properties. Those atoms, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, even when assembled perfectly, don't create the desired result. Now, they exist in our body, there's no doubt about that. Life, most cells are self-replicating, they keep expanding and growing and changing. Even the bones in us reproduce themselves every 7-ish years, roughly. So, yeah, there's no doubt that those are made up of molecules. The problem is when you take the inert matter and you say, okay, let there be life, we haven't pulled it off. We can clone things, we can manipulate things, we can genetically splice, we can take living stuff and make other living stuff. But even that example, if you take a horse plus a donkey, you get a mule. You know how mules reproduce? They don't. They're sterile. It's a minor problem. There's a difference of one chromosome pattern between a horse and a donkey. Therefore, mules cannot create sperm or eggs. They are incapable of reproduction because the chromosome patterns don't perfectly match. Big problem for evolutionists. They get one thing and it breeds with another thing and it keeps breeding and will ignore even recessive and dominant traits because obviously albinos, for instance, are very uncommon. We would think if you had 2 albinos and they were to reproduce, you get another albino. That's not what happens. Mutations generally are destructive and generally don't get passed on.
Is the atom alive? I just want to ask.
I think we would say the basic building blocks of chemistry are not life in and of themselves. They're qualities to life from things like reproduction, replication, ability to, in most cases, move at some level. So there is usually propulsion in most complex life forms at least. So we would say those building blocks take a form that then has characteristics of life. And so that's why even when you take those building blocks, you go, okay, Shazam, give it a bunch of energy and the right food and, you know, a warm place to be, no life. And it's interesting in this place where cosmology keeps trying to replace God. At, again, the telescopic level, we say there's dark matter. It's this mysterious stuff that fills and holds the universe together that nobody's ever seen. I know that sounds like God, but you have to pretend it's not God. And you know what the evidence for it is? Because all of the calculations that show how galaxies and universes behave requires it. Which again sounds an awfully lot like the teleologic argument for God, doesn't it? There's this order. There must be a cause for the order. Therefore, we'll call it dark matter. Nobody's ever seen it. We just theoretically say it's there because there's a big space and something's got to exist. Because otherwise, gravity and the ways that the universe increases wouldn't work. At the telescopic or even submolecular level, even below the protons and neutrons in the components of atom, is quanta or quantum particles. And this is where you get this whole idea of quantum field theory. And really what it's trying to do is give a mathematical explanation for why matter interacts the way it does. How maybe matter comes into place. And in fact, it was popularized by the Higgs boson particle, you know, theoretically for 50-ish years, in practice from the CERN collider back roughly 10 years ago now. And it was nicknamed the God particle. It was an overt statement by science going, we don't like God, therefore we'll call it a God particle. Because it does God-like things. And it creates things like quantum entanglement, we'll talk about in a minute. And now, believe it or not, we've adopted comic book theories into science and said multiverse now. Because the odds are so ridiculously large. If you consider all of the atoms in the universe, it's about 10 to the 80th power is what the current estimate is. Carl Sagan, who obviously was an atheist, said just for life to exist on Earth is 10 to the 2,500,000th power. Think of 2.5 million zeros going, one of those. You know, one of the examples was if you had a bunch of chimpanzees and typewriters all going at once, and they were trying to type out the first 100 words of a Shakespearean sonnet, that it would take them over 2 trillion years and require several million multiverses to even have a statistically credible conversation that could happen. And hence why we have a multiverse, because there's no way any longer with the complexity that we understand that a singular universe, even as vast as it is, can explain the odds by chance. Yeah?
Is the universe continuing to expand?
Yes. And in fact, the big problem is it seems to be accelerating in its expansion, which breaks many of the earlier theoretical rules. You'd expect it to de-accelerate over time due to the laws of entropy. But it's actually increasing in speed in the expansion. Which again doesn't follow anything we can observe of any explosion we've ever documented. Things slow over time as they get farther from the explosion. And yet, again, very credible scientists will say, we have no evidence of a multiverse, but it must exist to explain the fact this one that we live in actually exists. If I accept the thesis there is no God, I have to somehow overcome such ridiculous mathematical odds that either, again, Dawkins asked, I accept alien seeding, and we don't ask where aliens came from, Or I accept that there's literally millions or billions of parallel universes that we've struggled even with fourth dimension time space, ever even crossing into that region, let alone multiple universes. And you will have very educated cosmologists saying with a very straight face, this isn't just the lore of comic books anymore, that this is actual science. Quantum entanglement. I love Einstein's discussion. Spooky action at a distance. One of the leading physicists' minds of our lifetimes, and his idea was it's unexplainable. Why do two particles at vast differences apart? If you do experiment on one here, it replicates over here at a long ways apart without any physical or field connection that we know of. And so this was that Nobel Prize that what in essence these three researchers said is that classical matter, atoms, neurons, protons, are operated on by an outside force or hidden variables that we can't understand. Again, we're not going to call it God because that would be horrible. We're just going to say there's this mysterious force. And it's big enough to influence matter and space. And their best theory currently is this idea of entanglement, that somehow in the passing at the quantum level, there's this interlacing of particles, way beyond anything we can see. Even the collider, sometimes you can kind of get deflections off of something and they speculate it's a particle. But it's created this very significant problem when you destroy the current standard model of physics that everybody is held to and cling to and said, no, I think we can extrapolate from this and explain the unified theory of everything, and got through curveball, in my opinion. He said, oh, by the way, the last 40 or 50 years of quantum physics has now gone out the window because there are now particles and forces that are not behaving the way they should have by the mathematical models. And what force is big enough to influence across time and space with no known interconnectedness? So flipping back to with God, everything makes sense. There's an order that's reasoned. Yes, things happen, car accidents happen. We see the experience and consequences of sin. I mean, there are evil things that still happen, but it's within an order. And we have a confidence that we believe that at the end, God wins. That His salvation plan for each of us is sufficient, that at the end of time, we end up in a new heaven and new earth. We see the tree of life again. We see the throne of God. We see heavens in all of their majesty, and we can comprehend them in ways we can't today. And I think that's where a hope comes in a world right now that's struggling. Emerson said 160 years ago, most men live lives of quiet desperation. And I think if you take God out of the equation, that is your inevitable, reasonable, logical conclusion. It is all vanity. There is no purpose if there is no creator and no order and no plan. If it's just random chance, then literally I'm rolling a dice to determine my future. And I think there's a couple of core principles that comes with this. I would argue when God is creator, there are universal constants in truth. With a capital T, there are absolute truths, not relativistic ones. And I find it very interesting that Einstein's theory of relativity that got shoehorned into philosophy, that morality was relativistic, which wasn't what Einstein meant at all. Even the relativistic side has now been disproven because of quantum entanglement. It turns out there are some absolute certainties in life, even at the biomolecular level. And I think the fact we have a conscience demonstrates to us that there is a moral code. There's a reasoned order. If I take my pen and I drop it, everybody in this room has a pretty good idea of what's going to happen every time. If it floated, we'd go, wow, that's not supposed to happen that way. But because of the order, we can structure our affairs and our lives around a predictable set of circumstances for the most part. And in God, we have an absolute certainty that even when the most tragic moments of life happen, there still is a plan, a purpose, and order. And I think most importantly is this idea there's an eternal relationship with Him. If God exists outside of time and space, it's certainly within His purview to give us the new heaven, new earth, the new body, to allow our soul to exist outside of the physical constraints of a human body or a new body, and that there's a promise of salvation. And we'll see that even embedded in the curse next week, 2 weeks from now. And it's interesting where John starts off his book reflecting on Genesis. In the beginning was a word, in Greek, logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and through Him all things were made. With Him nothing was made that has been made. In Him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. That spoken word, God breathed, God spoke, is the very manifestation now of Christ. The power of creation said, at a focal point in history, I will become the perfect salvation to restore all that's been broken so far. And we know, we live it, all of us, as we age, a few parts of the body don't work exactly like they used to. We realize that there is a mortality to us. And there's an aging process, there is decay. Anybody feel like you're evolving? Body's getting better every day.
Yeah, right.
20 was
Only in the
nothing.
dream.
All right, I'm going to keep sampling. Maybe we'll find one. But unfortunately, the world we do actually live in that's empirically demonstrable is its decay. And yet Christ says, I overcome all that. You know what, and it's interesting to me where God shows off His creativity. This has been one I've had some interesting debates with evolutionists on. Why do you need pain to be so extreme, not just a little caution light? Why do you have beauty? There's no evolutionary necessity of beauty. Survival is not based upon brilliant colors as we see in the universe or the complexity of design. And yet, Google amazing fish sometime and you'll see thousands of amazing patterns. God breaks out His paintbrush. When the waters are teeming with fish, it wasn't the same fish a million times. It was thousands of different fish. The places on Earth. And hopefully some of you have had an opportunity to go to some places that were mind-blowing. And you went, wow, there's a God and I'm not it. We talked about neurons. Here's a real close microscopic image of two of them up against each other with the neurotransmitters going back and forth. And the millions of those that it takes to form a single thought. These little white things, this is actually a leaf on a tree. And the white little things stick out just enough so the frost and snow doesn't sit directly on the leaf and burn it, basically, frostbite it. This amazing diversity that if you take a moment to look, both just with our visual acuity, but through the telescope and the microscope, you start going, okay, creation's pretty darn diverse. And maybe there's a message in it for us, that He intended each of us to be fearfully and wonderfully made, unique, with our own skills, our own purposes that no one else replicates. My wife would say after 31 years of marriage that it's a good thing there's not two of me. This idea that I hold is that before the moment of creation, God already had foreknown, had planned all of existence, all of time. All of us in this room were known to Him, whatever distance we want to put creation back. But He said, in this space, in this time, in this place, these unique human beings will exist as part of my body. And I think as Creator, when we are in the majesty of His creation, the infinite existence of what He designed, We do owe him our lives and our worship. Some of us have had a few near-death experiences, understood life's maybe a little more fragile than we'd hoped. We've had that moment of looking to the brink and going, okay. And when we get to those moments, hopefully, our soul resonates with this joy that says, you know what, like Paul said, for me to live as Christ, but to die as gain. I'd like every minute I can to do God's work here, but when it's time and I'm done, okay, I'm ready for the next side of the journey. And so one question I'd like you to think about is, how would you live differently if you truly believe that the massive power of creation was one prayer away? We as New Testament believers have the Holy Spirit indwelling us. We have the power of Christ interacting with us. We have a high priest who calls us friend, who puts us as co-heir to creation. And I know we can intellectualize this sometimes and just go, oh yeah, of course. But think about that and its practical realities. And this isn't that, God is some magic jukebox or lottery machine that we just pick our wonderful things and hope he answers. But if we're operating on mission and purpose with his plan, is there anything in this cosmos that can stand in the way? Or are we assured that what he calls us to, he will equip us for? And sometimes we don't know the consequence of everything we do. We may never see a seed we've planted come to fruition. That is reality on this earth. But God didn't waste anything in the system of physics and energy and chemistry as we understand it. Everything has a place, a purpose, and a reaction that's equal and opposite to whatever you do. And I think that holds true. I think there are spiritual laws just as there are physical laws. And one of those is God doesn't waste our faithful obedience. That just as sure as gravity exists, that when we live on purpose and are obedient to him, there is a direct consequence as a result of that. Now, I'm not going to say on this earth you're going to see all of them come to fruition. Some are strangers that you may never see again. I've had a few, by grace that, were set in motion at one time, and then 20, 30, 40 years later I heard of a result. But that's the rarity. A lot of times I don't see the fruit that's born. And so as we think about Psalms 19, the heavens declare the glory of God and the sky proclaims his handiwork. That all that we can see, touch, taste, feel, experience is a sliver of God's creation. And a tiny one at that. It hopefully paints for you a sense of the majesty that I'm as guilty as anyone else, waking up and I heard a great quote the other day, and it said, I'm not much, but I'm all I think about. And I think we all get there. We all live in our own little crud ring, our own little sphere of existence, and it's very easy to think about us. But if you think about God for a moment, and you understand the extent to which he went to say, I'm here, I'm real, I have a plan, and I have order. Come join me in it. Come be part of the management stewardship, as we'll see next week, of my creation. It can be a very exciting premise. And it defies our human limitations. So any questions? I'm sure I made a lot of heads hurt, but what questions came out of it?
I think you answered an incredible amount.
Yeah.
Just gotta take it in.
Yeah.
I feel like I was back in school.
Yeah.
Well, remember, God's a lot bigger than what we ascribe him in our normal existence. And I think if you spend time reflecting on that this week, God has a way of revealing him to each of us. Here's what I want from you right now. I understand your limits. I understand where you're at in life. I understand what your skills are. And I will put divine appointments in front of you. so that you can operate within that.
What I see is, I see the youth group, and I
Mhm.
see them with some armor that they
Mhm.
haven't had before, so
Mhm.
I would like them
Yeah.
to hear you, and because most of them are able to understand what you said. I mean,
Yeah.
they haven't had some experience, but, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm 85, and it's given me something I hadn't even considered a
Mhm.
reason, so
Mhm.
thank you.
Absolutely. Well, and be in prayer for the youth group. I mean, they are in this fight regularly. They're being indoctrinated that random chance is the only possible explanation. And quite honestly, it's one of the reasons the younger generation is leaving church at higher percentages than ever before in recent history. They're giving up because nobody's telling them the other side of the equation and saying, well, what about this? Because that model won't explain the moment of creation, won't explain why certain particles behave the way they did. Yeah.
Do you have a recording or something that we can get?
This is being recorded, so it will be on the church YouTube channel. And feel free to share it. Yeah.
Is it possible to get a printout of all these notes?
Yeah, I'll see if we can link them on the YouTube channel.
So
as a
we can
link.
print them out?
Yeah.
That would be awesome. Because you said so much on the bylines
Yeah.
and this, that,
Mhm.
thank you.
Yep.
Maybe-
Plus from here, they're.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll lobby for the larger screen for next time.
Yeah, right, there you go.
I will say this, Brian, I don't think I could be your friend anymore. You're way too smart for me.
Well, in the words of Forrest Gump, stupid is as stupid does, so I'm stupid enough. I've made my share of mistakes. I think my tombstone will read, well, that didn't work out how I hoped.
We have to start calling you doctor.
No, God's enabled me to have a certain path, and I enjoy being able to do it. I think my hope for all of you is you take a small fragment of this away and have a confidence in your faith that in a world that tries to be corrosive, there are counterpoints, and there are very brilliant scientists who are saying, wait a minute, this isn't working the way that the model says it's supposed to, and oh, by the way, it's not big enough to explain this ever-increasing infinite universe. Yep.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge and gifts with me today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I will be hanging around for the potluck, and so we're going to do that right next door. So those of you that brought food can go pull it out, and we will enjoy a little fellowship. If you've got other questions, feel free to ask them.